Why are some students motivated to learn and to reach their goals? And why are some students struggling to be like this? Now, motivation stimulates, guides, and sustains learning. It's an important building block of regulated learning, the set of attitudes and mental processes that allow a person to steer their own learning. Now, self-regulated learning involves the action of learning itself, as well as the metacognitive processes that help learners plan what and how to learn and evaluate the outcomes of their learnings. As you will see in this lesson, differences in motivation are an important source in the diversity in classroom, comparable in importance in differences in prior knowledge, ability, or developmental readiness. Now, when it comes to school learning, students' motivation take on a special importance because students' mere presence in classroom, of course, no guarantee that students really want to learn. It's only a sign that students live in a society requiring young people to attend schools. Now, since modern education is compulsory, teachers cannot take students' motivation for granted, and they have a responsibility to ensure students' motivation to learn. Somehow or other, teachers must persuade students to want to do what students have to do anyway. Now, this tasks understanding and therefore influencing students' motivation to learn is the focus of this lesson. Fortunately, as you will see later on, there are ways of accomplishing this task that respect students' choices, desires, and attitudes. Like motivation itself, theories of it are full of diversity. For convenience in navigating through the diversity, we have I'm going to talk about six major theories or perspectives about motives and their sources. We call the topics motives as behavior change, motives as goals, motives as interest, motives as attribution about success, motives about beliefs about self-efficacy, and motives as self-determination. We end this video with a discussion on how self-determination can be applied inside the classroom. So, sometimes it's useful to think of motivation not as something inside the student driving the student's behavior, but as an equivalent to the student's outward behavior. Now, this is the perspective of behaviorism, which is a way to think about the learning process. We have talked about behaviorism in one of our previous lessons. Now, in its most thoroughgoing form, behaviorism focuses almost completely on what can be directly seen or heard about a person's behaviors. Now, and has relatively few comments about what may lie behind or underneath or even inside the behavior. When it comes to motivation, this perspective means minimizing or even ignoring the distinction between the inner drive of or energy of students and the outward behaviors that expresses the drive or energy. Now, the two are considered the same or nearly so. Now, equating the inner and the outward might seem to violate common sense. How can a student do something without some sort of feeling or thought to make the action happen? As I will explain later, this very question has led to alternative models of motivation that are based on cognitive rather than behaviorist theories. We will know later on some of these. But before getting into them, however, I encourage you to consider the advantages of behaviorist perspectives on behaviorism. Sometimes, the circumstances of teaching limits teachers' opportunities to distinguish between inner motives and outward behaviors. Certainly, teachers see plenty of students' behaviors, and this can be signs of motivation of some sort, but But the multiple demand of teaching can limit the time needed to determine what the behavior means. If a student asks a lot of questions during discussion, for example, is he or she curious about the material itself or just wanting to look intelligent in front of classmates and the teachers? Um, in a class with many students and a busy agenda, there may be fewer time for a teacher to decide between these possibilities. In other cases, the problem may not be limited time as much as communication difficulties with a student. Consider a student who is still learning English or who belong to a cultural community that uses patterns of conversations that are unfamiliar to the teacher, or who has a disability that that limits the student's general language skills. In these cases, discerning the student's inner motivation may take more time and effort. It is important to invest the extra time and effort for such students, but while the teacher is doing so, it's also important for her to guide and influence a student's behavior in constructive directions. That is where behaviorist approach to motivation can actually help. Now, the most common version of behavioral perspective on motivation is the theory of operant conditioning associated with B.F. Skinner, which we have talked about before. In the said previous lesson, we've looked at operant conditioning on behavioral learning, but the same operant model can be transformed into an account of motivation. In the operant model, you may recall a behavior being learned as the operand increases in frequency or likelihood because performing it makes a reinforcement available. To understand this model in terms of motivation, think of the likelihood of responses as the motivation and the reinforcement as the motivator. Imagine, for example, that a student learns by operant conditioning to answer questions during class discussion. Each time the student answers a question, the operand, or in this case, the motivation, the teacher praises, which can be called as the reinforcer, or the reinforcer, or the motivator. This behavior. Now, in addition to thinking of this situation as behavioral learning, however, you can also think of it in terms of motivation. The likelihood of the student answering question is the motivation is increased because of the student's praises, or the motivator. Now, many concepts of operant conditioning in fact can be understood in motivational terms. Another one, for example, is the concept of extinction, which is as we have talked about before, the tendency for learned behaviors to become less likely when reinforcements no longer occur. A sort of unlearning, or at least a decrease in performance of previously learned behavior. Now, the decrease in performance frequency can be thought of as a loss of motivation, and removal of the reinforcement can be thought of as the removal of the motivator. Now, as we have talked about earlier, behaviorist perspective about motivation do reflect a classroom reality. The teachers sometimes lack time and therefore must focus simply on students' appropriate outward behaviors. But there are nonetheless cautions about adopting this view. An obvious one is the ambiguity of student-specific behaviors. What look like a sign of one motive to the teacher may in fact be a sign of some other motive to the student. If the student looks at the teacher intently while she is speaking, does it mean that the student is motivated to learn, or only that the student is daydreaming? If a student invariably looks away while the teacher is speaking, does it mean that the student is disrespectful of the teacher, or that the student comes from a family or cultural group where avoiding eye contact actually show more respect for a speaker than direct eye contact? Now, another concern about behaviorist perspective, including operant conditioning, is that it leads teachers to ignore students' choices and preferences and to play God by making choices on their behalf. Now, according to this criticism, the distinction between inner motive and expressions of motives in outward behavior does not disappear just because a teacher or a psychological theory chooses to treat a motive and the behavioral expression of a motive as equivalent. Students usually do know what they want or desire, and their wants or desires may not always correspond to what a teacher chooses to reinforce or ignore. Now, this in a new guise is once again the issue of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Approaches that are exclusively behavioral are not sensitive enough to students' intrinsic self-sustaining motivation. That there is actually truth to this allegation. If a teacher actually does rely on rewarding behavior that she alone has chosen, or even if she persists in reinforcing behaviors that students already find motivating without external reinforcements. Now, in those cases, reinforcements can backfire. Instead of serving as an incentive to desired behavior, reinforcements can become a reminder of the teacher's power and the student's lack of control over their own actions. Now, a classic research study of intrinsic motivation illustrated that problem nicely. In the study, researchers rewarded university students for two activities, solving puzzle and writing newspaper headlines, that they already found interesting. Now, some of the students, however, were paid to do these activities, whereas others were not. Under these conditions, the students who were paid were less likely to engage in this activity following the experiment than were the students who were not paid, even though both groups had been equally interested in the activities to begin with. Now, the extrinsic reward of payment, it seems, interfered with the intrinsic reward of working the puzzles. Actually, later studies confirmed this effect in numerous situations, though they have also found certain conditions where extrinsic reward do not produce intrinsic rewards. Extrinsic rewards are not as harmful, for example, if a person is paid by the hour as compared to being paid flat rate rather than piecemeal by the number of items completed. Now, they also are less harmful if the task itself is relatively well defined, like working math problems or playing software and playing solitaire. And high quality performance is expected at all times. So there are still times and ways where externally determined reinforcements are useful and effective. In general, however, extrinsic reward do seem to undermine intrinsic motivation often enough that they need to be used selectively and thoughtfully. As it happens, help with being selective and thoughtful can be found in other more cognitively oriented theories of motivation. These use goals, interests, and beliefs of students as a way of, or as ways of explaining differences in students' motives and in how the motives affects engagement with schools. So we turn to these cognitively oriented theories next, beginning with those focused on students' goals. Now, one way motives varies by the kind of goals that students see for themselves and by how the goals support students' academic achievement. As you might have suspect, some goals encourage academic achievements more than others, but even motives that do not concern academics explicitly tend to affect learning indirectly. So, what kind of achievement goals do students hold? Imagine three individuals, Maria, Sarah, and Lindsay, who are taking algebra together. Maria's main concern is to learn the material as well as possible because she finds it interesting and because she believes it will be useful in her later courses, perhaps at a university. Hers is a mastery goal because she wants primarily to learn or to master the material. Sarah, however, is concerned less about algebra than about getting top marks on the exam and in the course. Hers is a performance goal because she is focused primarily on looking successful, and learning algebra is merely a vehicle for performing well in the eyes of peers and teachers. Lindsay, for her part, is primarily concerned about avoiding a poor or failing mark. Hers is a performance avoidance goal or failure avoidance goal because she's not really as concerned about learning algebra as Maria is or about competitive success as Sarah is. She's simply intending to avoid failure. As you might have imagined, mastery, performance, and performance avoidance goals often are not experienced in pure forms, but but more people actually experience them in combination. If you play the clarinet in the school band, you might want to improve your technique simply because you enjoy playing as well as possible, essentially a mastery orientation. But you might also want to look talented in the eyes of your classmates, a performance orientation. Another part of what you may wish, at least privately, is rather to avoid looking like a complete failure in playing the clarinet. One of these motives may predominate over the others, but they all may be present at one time. Now, mastery goals tend to be associated with enjoyment of learning the material at hand. And in this sense, represents an outcome that teachers often seek for students. By definition, therefore, they are a form of intrinsic motivation. As such, mastery goals have been found to be better than performance goals at sustaining students' interest in a subject. In one review of research about learning goals, for example, students with primarily mastery orientation towards a course they were taking not only tended to express greater interest in the course, but also continued to express interest well beyond the official end of the course, and to enroll in further courses in the same subject. Performance goals, on the other hand, imply extrinsic motivation and tend to show the mixed effect of this orientation. A positive effect is that the student with a performance orientation do tend to get higher grades than those who express primarily mastery orientation. The advantage in grades occur both in the short term with individuals' assignments and in the long term with overall grade point average when graduating. But there is evidence that performance-oriented students do not actually learn materials as deeply or as permanently as students who are more mastery-oriented. A possible reason is the measure of performance, such as a test score, often rewards relatively shallow memorization of information and therefore guide performance-oriented students away from processing the information thoughtfully or deeply. Another possible reason is that a performance orientation, by focusing on gaining recognition as the best among peers, encourages competition among peers. Giving and receiving help from classmates is thus not in the self-interest of a performance-oriented student, and the resulting isolation limits the student's learning. Now, there are goals that actually avoid achievement indirectly, and we have talked about one of these earlier. That is failure avoidant goals. So, as I have mentioned earlier, failure avoidant goal by nature undermines academic achievements. Often, they are negative byproduct of the competitiveness of the performance goals. If a teacher and sometimes also fellow students put too much emphasis on being the best in the class, and if interest in learning the material is such as such therefore suffers, then some students may decide that success is beyond their reach or may be not even desirable in any case. So alternative simply the uh, alternative simply avoiding failure may seem wiser as well as more feasible. Once a student adopts this attitude, he or she may underachieve more or less deliberately, doing only the minimum work necessary to avoid looking foolish or to avoid serious conflict with the teacher. Now, avoiding failure in this way is an example of self-handicapping, deliberate actions and choices that reduces chance of success. Students may self-handicap in a number of ways. In addition to not working hard, they may procrastinate about completing assignment, for example, or set goals that are unrealistically high. The second type of goal that affects achievement indirectly is that of social goals. Most students need and value relationships, both with classmates and with teachers. And often, though not always, they get a good deal of positive support from these relationships. But the effect of social relationships are complex and at times can work both for and against academic achievement. If a relationship with the teacher is important and reasonably positive, then the student is likely to try to please the teacher by working hard on assignments. Note, though, that this effect is closer to performance than mastery. The student is primarily concerned about looking good to someone else's eyes. If, on the other hand, a student is especially concerned about relationship with peers, the effect of achievement depends on the student's motives for relationships as well as on peers' attitudes. Now, desiring to be close to peers personally may lead a student to ask for help from and give help to peers, a behavior that may support higher achievement, at least to a certain point. Now, but desiring to impress peers with skills and knowledge may lead to the opposite. As we have already mentioned earlier, the competitive edge of such a performance orientation may keep the students or the student from collaborating with each other, and in this indirect way reduce a student's opportunity to learn. So the abilities and achievement motivation of peers themselves can also make a difference, but once again, the effect vary depending on the context. Low achievement and motivation by peers affect an individual's academic motivation more in elementary school than in high school, more in learning mathematics than learning to read, and more if there is a wide range of abilities in classroom than if there is more narrow range. So in spite of these complexities, social relationships are valued so highly by most students that teachers should generally facilitate them, though also keep an eye on their nature and their consequent effect on achievement. As I will explain further later on, many assignments can be accomplished productively in groups. For example, as long as the group are formed thoughtfully, such as by choosing group tasks wisely and recognizing all members' contribution are fully as fully as possible. Relationships can also be supported with activities that involve students or adults from another class or from outside the school, as often happens with school or community service projects. These can provide considerable social satisfaction and can sometimes be connected to current curriculum needs. But the majority of students' social contacts are likely always to come from students' own initiatives with each other in simply taking time to talking and interacting with one another. The teacher's job is to encourage these forms or these informal contacts, especially when they happen at times that support rather than interfere with learning. In addition to holding different kinds of goals with consequent differences in academic motivation, students show obvious differences in levels of interest in the topics and the task of the classroom. Suppose that two high school classmates, Frank and Jason, both are taking chemistry and especially learning how to balance chemical equations. Now, Frank finds the material boring and has to force himself to study it. As a result, he spent only the time needed to learn basic materials and to complete the assignment at basic level. Jason, on the other hand, enjoys the challenge of balancing chemical equations. He thinks of the task as an intriguing puzzle. He not only solves each of them, but also compares the problem to each other as he goes through them. Frank's learning is based on the effort, or rather on effort compared to Jason's, whose learning is based on more fully on interest. As the example implies, when students learn from interest, they tend to devote more attention to the topic than if they learn from effort. The findings is not surprising since interest is another aspect of intrinsic motivation, energy or drive that comes from within. A distinction between effort and interest is often artificial. However, because the two motives often get blended or combined in students' personal experiences. Most of us can remember times when we worked at a skill that we enjoyed and found interesting, but that also required effort to learn. The challenge for teachers is to therefore draw on and encourage students' interest as much as possible, and thus keep the required effort within the reasonable bounds, neither too hard nor too easy. Now, students' interests vary in how deeply or permanently they are located within students. Situational interests are ones that are triggered temporarily by features of immediate situation. Unusual sight, sound, or words can stimulate situational interest. A teacher might show an interesting image on the overhead projector, or play a brief bit of music, or make a surprising comment in passing. At a more abstract level, unusual or surprising topics of discussion can also arouse interest when they are first introduced. Personal interests are relatively permanent preferences of the students and are usually expressed in a variety of situations. In the classroom, a student may or may not have a personal interest in a particular topic, activities, or subject matter. Outside class, though, he or she usually has additional personal interest in particular non-academic activities like sports or music, or even in particular people like a celebrity, an influencer, a friend who lives nearby. Now, the non-academic personal interest may sometimes conflict with academic interest. May be more it may be more interesting to go to like a shopping mall with, let's say, a friend than to study even your most favorite subject. Now, in general, personal interest in academic topic or activity tend to correlate with achievement related to the topic or activity. As you might suppose, a student who is truly interested is more likely to focus on the topic or activity more fully, to work at it for longer periods, to use more thoughtful strategies in learning, and to enjoy doing so. Now, small wonder that a student small wonder that the student achieves more. Note, though, a persistent ambiguity about this benefit. It is often not clear whether personal interest lead to higher achievement or higher achievement leads to stronger interest. Either possibility seem plausible. Research to sort them out, however, has suggested that at least some of the influences go in the direction from interest to achievement. When elementary students were given books from which to learn about a new topic, for example, they tend to learn more from books which they chose themselves than from books that were simply assigned to them. So interests seem to lead to learning, but this conclusion does not rule out its converse, that achievement may stimulate interest as well. Now, if a student has little prior personal interest in a topic or activity, the teacher is faced with a stimulating stimulating initial situational interest in hopes that the initial interest will gradually become more permanent and personal. There are a number of strategies for meeting this challenge. First is to, or rather, it helps to include surprises in your comments and in classroom activities from time to time. Tell students facts that are true but counterintuitive, for example, or demonstrate a science experiment that turns out differently than students expected. It also helps to relate new material to students' prior experience, even if their experiences are not related to academic or to school directly. The concept of gravitation and acceleration, for example, operate every time a ball is hit or thrown in in a baseball game or in a basketball game. If this connection is pointed out to the student who enjoys playing lots of basketball, the concept can make or the concepts can make concepts more interesting. It also helps to encourage students to respond to new materials actively. By having students talk about the materials together, for example, students can begin making their own connections to prior personal interest, and the social interaction itself help to link the material to their personal social interest as well. And with that, let's move on to motives related to attributions. Now, attributions are perceptions about the cause of success and failures. Suppose that you get a low mark on a test and are wondering what caused the low mark. You can construct various explanations for make various attributions about these failures. Maybe you did not study very hard. Maybe the test itself was difficult. Maybe you were unlucky. Maybe you just are not smart enough. Each explanation attributes the failure to a different factor. The explanations that you settle upon may reflect the truth actively or accurately, or then again, they may not. What is important about attribution is that they reflect personal beliefs about the source or causes of success and failures. As such, they tend to affect motivation in various ways depending on the nature of the attribution. So, attributions vary in three underlying ways: locus, stability, and controllability. Locus of an attribution is the location, figuratively speaking, of the source of success or failure. If you attribute a top mark on a test to your ability, then the locus is internal, or you have an internal locus of control. If you attribute the mark to the test having easy questions, then the locus is external, or that you have an external locus of control. The stability of an attribution is its relative permanence. If you attribute the mark to your ability, then the source of success is relatively stable by definition. Ability is a relatively lasting quality. If you attribute a top mark to the effort you put in to studying, then the source of success is unstable. Effort can vary and has to be renewed on each occasion, or else it disappears. Now, the controllability of an attribution is the extent to which the individual can influence it. If you attribute a top mark to your effort at studying, then the source of success is relatively controllable. If you can influence effort simply by deciding how much to study. But if you attribute the mark to simply luck, then the source of success is uncontrollable. There is nothing that you can do to influence random chances. As you might have suspect, the way that these attributions combine affects students' academic motivation in major ways. It's usually uh, It usually helps both motivation and achievement if a student attributes academic successes and failures to factors that are internal and controllable, such as effort or a choice to use particular learning strategies. Attribution or attributing success to factors that are internal but stable or controllable, like ability, on the other hand, is both a blessing and a curse. Sometimes it can create optimism about prospects for future success, like I always do well, but it can also lead to indifference about correcting mistakes, or even create pessimism if a student happens not to perform at the accustomed level. Maybe I'm not as smart as I thought, a student may say. Worst of all, for academic motivation are attributions, whether stable or not, related to external factors. Believing that performance depend on simply on luck, or when students say that the teacher was in a bad mood when marking, or excessive difficulty of materials, remove incentive for a student to invest in learning. All in all, then, it seems important for teachers to encourage internal, stable attributions about success. So, the most common challenges of teaching students with behavior. Now, the question is how to actually do this. Now, um, one way or another, the effective strategies involve framing teachers' own explanations of successes and failures around internal controllable factors. Instead of telling a student, good work, you're smart, you may want to try saying, good work, your effort really made a difference. So, if a student fails, instead of saying, too bad, the material is just too hard for you, try saying, let's find a strategy for practicing this more, and then you can try again. In both cases, the first option emphasizes uncontrollable factors, effort, difficulty level, and the second option emphasizes internal controllable factors, effort, the use of specific strategies. But such attributions will only be convincing, however, if teachers provide appropriate conditions for students to learn. Conditions in which students' effort really do pay off. There are three conditions that have to be in place in particular. First, academic task and material actually have to be about the right level of difficulty. If you give problems in advanced calculus to a first grade student, the student will not only fail them but also be justified in attributing the failures to an external factor. If assignments are assessed in ways that produce high variability, unreliable marks, then students will rightly attribute their performance to an external unstable source, luck, but circumstances will interfere with motive. Both circumstances will actually interfere motivation. Second is that teachers also need to be ready to give help to individual who needs it, even if they believe that an assignment is easy enough or clear enough that students should not need individual help. Readiness to help is always essential because it's often hard to know in advance exactly how hard a task will prove to be for particular students. Without assistance, a task that proves difficult initially may remain difficult indefinitely, and the student will be tempted to make unproductive thought, though correct attributions about his or her failures. Like they might say, I will never understand this, I'm not smart enough, or it doesn't matter how hard I try because I will eventually fail. Third is that teachers need to remember that ability, usually considered a relatively stable factor, often actually changes incrementally over the long term. Recognizing this fact is one of the best ways to bring about actual increase in students' abilities. Um, a middle year student might play the trumpet in the school band at a higher level of ability, but this ability actually reflects a lot of previous effort and a gradual increase in ability. A second grade student who reads fluently in this sense may have high current ability to read, but at some point in the distant past, that same student could not read as well. And even further back, he may not even have the ability to read at all. The increase in ability have happened at least in part because of effort. While these ideas may seem obvious, they can easily be forgotten in the classroom because effort and ability evolve according to very different time frames. Effort and its result appears relatively immediate. A student expends effort for this week, this day, or even at the very moment. And the effort, if not the result, are visible right away. But ability may take longer to show itself. A student often develops it only over many weeks, months, or years. Uh, Here are some strategies for teaching students with. So now let's move on to motives as self-efficacy. So in addition to being influenced by their goals, interests, and attributions, students' motives are affected by specific beliefs about the student's personal capacity. In self-efficacy theory, the belief becomes a primary explicit explanation for motivation. Self-efficacy is the belief that you are capable of carrying out a specific task or of reaching a specific goal. Note that the belief and the action or goals are specific. Self-efficacy is a belief that you can write an acceptance term paper, for example, or repair an automobile or make friends with new students in class. These are relatively specific beliefs and tasks. Self-efficacy is not about whether you believe that you are intelligent in general, whether you always like working with mechanical things, or think that you are generally a likable person. These more general judgments are better regarded as various mixtures of self-concepts or beliefs about general personal identity or of self-esteem, evaluation of identity. They are more important in their own right and sometimes influence motivation, but only indirectly so. Self-efficacy beliefs, furthermore, are not the same as true or documented skills or ability. They are self-constructed meanings that they are personally developed perceptions. There can sometimes therefore be discrepancies between a person's self-efficacy belief and the person's actual ability. You can believe that you are good at writing term papers, for example, without actually being able to do so, and vice versa. You can believe yourself incapable of writing a paper but discover that you are in fact able to do so. In this way, self-efficacy is like the everyday idea of confidence, except that it's defined more precisely. And as with confidence, it's possible to have either too much of it or too little self-efficacy. The optimum levels seem to be either at or slightly above true capacity. As I will indicate later, large discrepancies between self-efficacy and ability can create motivational problems for the individual. So, Self-efficacy may sound like a uniformly desirable quality, but research as well as teachers' experience suggests that its effects are a bit more complicated than they first appear. Self-efficacy has three main effects, each of which has both a dark or undesirable side and a positive or desirable side. Now, the first effect is that self-efficacy can make students more willing to choose tasks where they already feel confident of succeeding. This effect is almost inevitable given the definition of the concept of self-efficacy. It also has been supported by research on self-efficacy beliefs. For teachers, the effect on choice can be either welcome or not, depending on circumstances. If a student believes that he or she can solve mathematical problems, then the student is more likely to attempt the mathematical homework that the teacher assigns. Unfortunately, the converse is also true. If a student believes that he or she is incapable of math, then the student is less likely to attempt the math homework, perhaps telling themselves, what's the use of trying, regardless of the student's actual ability in math. Since self-efficacy is self-constructed, furthermore, it's also possible for students to miscalculate or misperceive their true skills. And the misperception themselves can have complex effect on students' motivation. From a teacher's point of view, all is well even if students overestimate their capacity but actually do succeed at the relevant task anyway. Or if they underestimate their capacity yet discover that they can succeed and raise their self-efficacy beliefs as a result. All may not be well, though, if students do not believe that they can succeed and therefore do not even try. Or if students overestimate their capacity by a wide margin but are disappointed unexpectedly by failures and lower their self-efficacy beliefs. Now, a second effect of high self-efficacy is to increase an increase in persistence at relevant tasks. If you believe that you can solve crossword puzzles but encounter one that takes longer than usual, then you are more likely to work longer at that puzzle until you hopefully really do solve it. This is probably a desirable behavior in many situations, unless the persistence happen to interfere with other more important tasks. What if you should be doing homework instead of working on crossword puzzles? If you happen to have low self-efficacy in crossword, on the other hand, then you are more likely to give up early on a difficult puzzle. Giving up early may often be undesirable because it deprives you of a chance to improve your skills by persisting. Then again, or on the other hand, the consequent lack of success because of giving up may provide a useful incentive to improve your crossword skills. And again, misperception of capacity make a difference. Overestimating your capacity by a lot, that means you have excessively high self-efficacy, might lead you not to prepare for or focus on a task properly, and thereby impair your performance. So as with choosing tasks, the effects of self-efficacy vary from one individual to another and one situation to another. The teacher's task is therefore twofold. First is to discern the variation, and second is to encourage the positive self-efficacy belief. Lastly, high self-efficacy for a task not only increases a person's persistence at the task, but also improves their ability to cope with stressful conditions and to recover their motivation following outright failures. Suppose that you have two assignments, an essay and a science lab report that is due on the same day, and these circumstances promise promises to make your life a little hectic as you approach the deadline. You will cope better with stress of multiple assignments if you already believe your capability of doing both of the tasks than if you believe yourself capable of doing just one of them, especially of doing especially of doing neither. You will also recover better in the unfortunate event that you end up with a poor grade on one or even both of the tasks. Now, this is good news, right? Now, the bad news, at least from the teacher's point of view, is that the same resilience can sometimes also serve non-academic and non-school purposes. How so? Suppose instead of two school assignments due on the same day, a student has only one school assignment due but also holds a part-time evening job as a server at a local restaurant. Suppose further that the student has high self-efficacy for both of these tasks. He believes, in other words, that he is capable of completing the assignment as well as continuing to work at the job. The result of such resilient beliefs can easily be a student who devotes less attention to schoolwork than ideal, and who even ends up with a lower grade on the assignment than he or she is capable of. Now, if a person's sense of self-efficacy is very low, he or she can develop learned helplessness, a perception of complete lack of control in mastering a task. The attitude is similar to depression which is a pervasive feeling of apathy and a belief that effort makes no difference and does not lead to success. Learned helplessness was originally studied from the behaviorist perspective of classical and operant conditioning by the psychologist Martin Seligman. Now, the studies used a somewhat gloomy experimental procedure in which an animal, such as a rat or a dog, was repeatedly shocked in a cage in a way that prevented the animal from escaping the shock. In a later phase of the procedure, conditions were changed so that the animal could avoid the shock by merely moving from one side of the cage to another. Yet frequently they did not bother to do so. Seligman called this behavior learned helplessness. In people, learned helplessness lead to characteristic ways of dealing with problems. They tend to attribute the source of a problem to themselves, to generalize the problem to many aspects of life, and to see the problem as lasting or permanent. More optimistic individuals, in contrast, are more likely to attribute a problem to outside sources, to see it as a specific to a particular situation or activity, and to see it as a temporary or as temporary or time limited. Consider, for example, two students who each fail at a test or at a test. The one with a lot of learned helplessness is more likely to explain the failure by saying something like, "I'm stupid. I never perform well in any of my schoolwork, and I will never perform well at all." The other more optimistic student is more likely to say something like, "The teacher made the test too hard this time, so the test does not prove anything about how I will do the next time or in other subjects." What is noteworthy about these differences in perception is how much the more optimistic of these perspectives resemble high self-efficacy, and how much learned self-helplessness seem to contradict or differ from it. As already noted, high self-efficacy is a strong belief in one's capacity to carry out a specific task successfully. By definition, therefore, self-efficacy focuses attention on temporary or time-limited activity, even though the cause of successful completion is internal. Teachers can minimize learned helplessness in students, therefore, by encouraging their self-efficacy beliefs, and there are ways in doing so, as I will be explaining next. Now, psychologists who study self-efficacy have identified four major sources of self-efficacy beliefs. In order of importance, they are prior experiences of mastering skills, watching others master tasks, messages or persuasion from others, and number four, emotions related to stress and discomfort. Fortunately, the first three can be influenced by teachers. And even the fourth can sometimes be influenced indirectly by appropriate interpretative comments from the teachers or others. So, the first is, as we have mentioned earlier, prior experiences of mastery. Not surprisingly, past successes at a task increases students' belief that they will succeed again in the future. The implication of this basic fact means that teachers need to help students build a history of success. Whether they are math problems, reading assignments, or athletic activities, tasks have to end with success more often than with failure. Note, though, that the successes have to represent mastery that is genuine or competence that is truly authentic. Success at a task that are trivial or irrelevant do not improve self-efficacy beliefs, or nor does praise for successes that a student has not really had. Uh, the second is, or yeah, not yet, but as a practical matter, creating genuine history of success is most convincing if teachers also work to broaden a student's vision of the past. Younger students, that is elementary age, in particular, have relatively short or limited ideas of what it counts as past experiences. They may go back only a few occasions when forming impressions of whether they can succeed again in the future. Older students, on the other hand, gradually develop longer views of their personal pasts, both because of improvements in memory and because of accumulating a personal history that is truly longer. Now, the challenge for working with any age, however, is to ensure that students base self-efficacy beliefs on all relevant experiences from the past, not just on selected or recent experiences. The second, as I've already shown, is watching others' experiences of mastery. A second source of efficacy belief comes from vicarious experiences of mastery or by observing others' successes. Simply seeing someone else succeed at a task, in other words, can contribute to believing that you too can succeed. The effect is stronger when the observer lacks experience with the task and therefore may be unsure of his or her own ability. It's also stronger when the model is someone respected by the observer, such as a student's teacher, or a peer with generally comparable ability. Even under these conditions, though, vicarious experiences is not as influential as direct experience. The reasons are not hard to imagine. Suppose, for example, you witness both your teacher and a respected friend succeed at singing a favorite tune, but you, like myself, are unsure whether you personally can sing. In that case, you may feel encouraged about your own potential, but are likely still to feel somewhat uncertain of your own efficacy. If, on the other hand, you do not witness others singing, but you have a history of singing well yourself, it's a different story. In that case, you are likely to believe that in your efficacy regardless of how other people perform. All of which suggest that to a modest extent, teachers may be able to enhance student self-efficacy by modeling successes at a task or by pointing out classmates who are successful. These strategies can work because they are not only they not only show how to do a task but also communicate a more fundamental message: the fact that the task can in fact be done. If students are learning a difficult arithmetic procedure, for example, you can help by demonstrating the procedure or by pointing out classmates who are doing it. Note, though, that vicarious mastery is helpful only if backed up with real successes performed by the students themselves. It is also helpful only if the model classmates are perceived as truly comparable in ability. Overuse of vicarious models, especially in the absence of real success by learners, can cause learners to disqualify a model success. Students may simply decide that the student is out of their league in skill and is therefore irrelevant to judging their own potentials. Now, the third is social messages and persuasion. A third source of efficacy beliefs are encouragement, both implied and stated, that persuade a person of his or her own capacity to do the task. Persuasion does not create high efficacy by itself, but it often increases or support it when coupled with either direct or vicarious experience, especially when the persuasion comes from more than one person. For teachers, this suggests two things. The first, of course, is that encouragement can motivate students, especially when it's focused on achievement or achievable specific tasks. It can be motivating to say things like, I think you can do it, or I've seen you do this before, so I know that you can do it again. But the second implication is that teachers should arrange wherever possible to support their encouragement by designing tasks at hand that are in fact achievable by the students. Striking a balance of encouragement and task difficulty may seem straightforward, but sometimes it can be challenging because students can sometimes perceive teachers' comments and tasks quite differently from how teachers intend. Giving excessive amounts of detailed help, for example, may be intended as support for a student but be taken as a lack of confidence in the student's ability to do the task independently. Lastly, we have emotions related to stresses and or discomfort. Now, the previous three sources of efficacy beliefs are all rather cognitive, or you can say thinking-oriented. But emotions also influence expectations of successes or failures. Feeling nervous or anxious just before speaking to a large group, sometimes even just a class full of students, can function like a message that says, I'm not going to succeed at doing this. Even if there is, in fact, good reason to expect success. But positive feelings can also raise beliefs about self-efficacy. When recalling the excitement of success, of succeeding at a previous unrelated task, people may overestimate their chances of successes at a new task with which they have no previous experience and are therefore in no position to predict their efficacy. For teachers, the most important implication is that students' motivation can be affected when they generalize from past experiences which they believe rightly or wrongly to be relevant. By simply announcing a test, for example, a teacher can make some students anxious even before the students find out anything about the test, whether it is easy or difficult or even comparable in any way to other experiences called tests in the past. Conversely, it can be misleading to encourage students on the basis of their success at past academic tasks if either tasks were not really relevant to requirements of the new task at hand. Suppose, for example, that a middle year student has previously written only brief opinion-based papers and never written a research based paper before. In that case, boosting the student's confidence by telling him that it's just like the papers you used to write before may not actually be helpful or even honest. Lastly, let's talk about motivation as self-determination. Now, common sense suggests that human motivation originates from some sort of inner need. We all think of ourselves as having various needs. A need for food, for example, or a need for a companion that influences our choice and activities. This same idea also forms part of some theoretical accounts of motivation, though the theories differ in the needs that they emphasize or recognize. For example, Maslow's hierarchy of needs as an example of motivation that functions like needs that influence long-term personal development. According to Maslow, individuals must satisfy physical survival needs before they seek to satisfy needs of belonging. They satisfy belonging needs before esteem needs, and so on. In theory, too, people have both deficit needs and growth needs. And the deficit needs must be satisfied before growth needs can influence behavior. In Maslow's theory, as in others that uses the concept, a need is a relatively lasting condition or feeling that requires relief of or satisfaction that tend to influence action over long term. Some needs may decrease when satisfied, like that of hunger, but others may not, like curiosity. Now, either way, needs differ from self-efficacy beliefs discussed earlier, which are relatively specific and cognitive and affects particular tasks and behaviors fairly directly. Now, a recent theory of motivation based on the idea of needs is self-determination theory, proposed by the psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan. Now, the theory proposed that understanding motivation requires taking into account three basic human needs: autonomy, the need to feel free of external constraints on behavior; competence, the need to feel capable or skilled; and relatedness, the need to feel connected or involved with others. Note that these needs are all psychological, not physical, like hunger and sex, for example, and are not on the list. They are also about personal growth or development, and not about deficits that a person tries to reduce or eliminate. Unlike food in behaviorism or safety in Maslow's hierarchy, you can never get enough of autonomy, competence, or relatedness. You and your students will seek to enhance these continually throughout life. Now, the key idea of self-determination determination theory is that when persons, such as yourself and one of your students, feel that these basic needs are reasonably well met, they tend to perceive their actions and choice to be intrinsically motivated or self-determined. In that case, they can turn their attention to a variety of activities that they find attractive or important, but that do not relate directly to their basic need. Among your students, for example, some individuals might read books that you have suggested, and others might listen attentively when you explain key concepts from the unit that you happen to be teaching. If one or more basic needs are not met, however, people will tend to feel coerced by outside pressures or external incentives. They may become preoccupied, in fact, with satisfying whatever need has not been met and thus exclude or avoid activities that might otherwise be interesting, educational, or important. If a person or a student if the person are students, their learning will suffer. So let's talk about using self-determination theory in the classroom. So, what are some teaching strategies for supporting students' needs? Now, educational researchers have studied these questions from a variety of directions, and their resulting recommendations converge and overlap in a number of ways. For convenience, the recommendations can be grouped according to the basic needs that they address, beginning with the need for autonomy. So, A major part of supporting autonomy is to give students choices wherever possible. So the choices that encourage the greatest feeling of self-control, obviously, are ones that are about relatively major issues or that have relatively significant consequences for students, such as whom to choose as a partner for a major group project. But choices also encourage some feelings of self-control even when they are about relatively minor issues, such as how to organize your desk or what kind of folder to use for storing your papers at school. It is important, furthermore, to offer choices to all students, including students needing explicit directions in order to work successfully. Avoiding reserving choices for only the best students or giving up offering choices altogether to students who fall behind or who need extra help. All students will feel more self-determined and therefore more motivated if they have some choices of some sort. Now, teachers can also support their students' autonomy more directly by minimizing external rewards like grades and comparison among students' performance, and by orienting and responding themselves to students' expressed goals and interests. In teaching elementary students about climate change, for example, you can support autonomy by exploring aspects or which aspects of this topic have already come to students' attention and aroused their concerns. The point of the discussion would not to find out who knows the most about the topic, but to build and enhance students' intrinsic motivation as much as possible. In reality, of course, it may not be possible to succeed at this goal fully. Some students may simply have no interest in the topic, for example, or you may be constrained by time or resources from individualizing certain activities fully. But any degree of attention to students' individuality as well as any degree of choice will support students' autonomy. Second is supporting the need for competence. Now, the most obvious way to make students feel competent is by selecting activities which are challenging but nonetheless achievable with reasonable effort and assistance. Although few teachers would disagree with this idea, there are times when it's hard to put into practice, such as when you first met at a class at the start of a school year and therefore are unfamiliar with their background and interest. But there are some strategies that are generally effective even if you are not yet in the position to know the students well. One is to emphasize activities that require active response from students. Sometimes this implies selecting projects, experiments, discussion and the like that require students to do more than simply listen. Oftentimes, it means expecting active responses in all interactions with students, such as by asking questions that call for divergent or multiple or elaborated answers. In a social studies class, for example, try asking what are some ways we could find out more about our community instead of tell me the 3 best ways to find out about our community. Now, the first question invites more divergent, elaborate answers than the second. Um, lastly, lastly, you can support the need to relate to others. The main way to support students' need to relate to others is to arrange activities in which students work together in ways that are mutually supportive, that recognizes students' diversity and minimizes competition about individuals. There is a lot more to say about this strategy, including the discussion of several varieties of cooperative learning and some of their pitfalls to be avoided. But for now, simply note that having students work together can help in many ways. You can, for example, deliberately arrange projects that require a variety of talents. Some educators call such activities rich group work. In a small group or in studying, in small groups about medieval society. For example, one student can contribute his drawing skills, another can contribute his writing skills, and still another can contribute his dramatic skills. The result can be a multifaceted presentation, written, visual, and oral, that now the groups needed for rich group work provide for students' relationship with each other, whether they contain 6 individuals or only 2. So, in summary, motivation, or the energy or drive that gives behavior direction and focus, can be understood in a variety of ways, each of which has implication for teaching. One perspective that we have talked about comes from behaviorism and equates underlying drives or motives with their outward visible expressions in behaviors. Most others, however, come from cognitive theories of learning and development. Motives are affected by the kind of goals set by the students, whether they are oriented to mastery, performance, or failure avoidance, or social contact. They are also affected by students' interest on both personal or interests that are both personal or situational. And they are affected by students' attribution about the causes of successes and failures, whether they perceive the causes are due to ability, effort, task difficulty, or luck. Now, a major current perspective about motivation is based on self-efficacy theory, which focus on a person's belief that he or she is capable of carrying out mastering a task. High self-efficacy students or high self-efficacy affects students' choice of task, their persistence at tasks, and their resilience in the face of failure. It helps to prevent learned helplessness, which is a perception of complete lack of control over mastery of success. Teachers can encourage high self-efficacy beliefs by providing students with experiences of mastery and opportunities to see others experience the same mastery, or by offering well-timed messages, persuading them of their capacity for success, and by interpreting students' emotional reaction to success, failures, and stresses. Lastly, an extension of self-efficacy theory is self-determination theory, which is based on the idea that everyone has basic needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness to others. According to this theory, students will be motivated more intrinsically if these 3 needs are met as much as possible. Now, a variety of strategies were offered earlier to assist you as future teachers in doing just that. So, this ends our lesson on student motivation, and this is actually the last lesson of this year. It does not mean that this is the last lesson for the entire semester, just for the year 2021. So, I'll see you next year. Again, my name is Dex Amitan, and thank you for watching.